Have you ever paid $45 for a set of hand warmers, a propane heater refill, and a bundle of campfire wood and still woken up cold at 3 a.m. because everything ran out around midnight? There is a chemical reaction that has been used in commercial food packaging, military self-heating rations, and industrial applications for over a century that costs about $1 per use, generates heat without any flame, and does not require fuel canisters that run empty at the worst possible time. The product is calcium oxide, which most people know as quicklime. The reaction is calcium oxide plus water. And the reason most campers have never thought to apply it is that nobody in the gear business makes money selling you a bag of powder from a masonry supplier for 80 cents a pound. Before I get into the practical application, yes, I want to be direct about something. The title of this video says, "Banned in 14 states." That is partially accurate and partially clickbait. And I am going to explain exactly what is and is not regulated, because you need to know the actual legal situation before you use this. I have been camping for over 20 years, and I have zero interest in getting you into legal trouble or into a situation where you get hurt because you skipped the safety section. Stay through the chemistry explanation because understanding what this reaction actually does is the difference between using it correctly and making a serious mistake. The safety section is not optional. And at the end, I will cover a specific container configuration that controls the reaction rate and makes this practical in a real camp setting rather than as a chemistry demonstration. The chemistry is worth understanding plainly. Calcium oxide, CaO, is the white powder sold at masonry supply stores and some agricultural co-ops under the name quicklime or burnt lime. When you add water to calcium oxide, you get an exothermic reaction. Exothermic means heat releasing. The chemical product is calcium hydroxide, which is slaked lime, and the byproduct is significant thermal energy. The temperature of that reaction depends on how much water you add, relative to how much quicklime you start with. At a stoichiometric ratio, which is the chemically ideal proportion of roughly 1 part water by weight to about 3 parts quicklime, the reaction surface temperature can reach around 150 degrees Celsius, which is about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, close to the surface temperature of a low-output propane heater. That is not my measurement. That is documented in industrial chemistry literature and replicated in numerous material safety data sheet references from calcium oxide manufacturers, including Carmeuse and Mississippi Lime, 2 of the primary commercial producers in the United States. This is the same basic reaction that makes self-heating military ration packs work. You have seen them if you have spent any time around military surplus gear, a pouch with a heating element inside that activates when you add a small amount of water. The commercial version uses a controlled ratio of calcium oxide and other minerals to manage the temperature and the reaction rate for food-safe heating. The underlying chemistry is identical. The gear companies selling those packs charge $8 to $15 per use. The same reaction using quicklime from a masonry supplier costs under $1. My wife has a predictable reaction when I explain this kind of math, which is something between mild interest and deep suspicion about where I am going with it. The interest is warranted. The suspicion is also warranted, because I did bring home a 5-pound bag of masonry quicklime and leave it on the kitchen counter without a good explanation attached. Here is where it gets practically useful for camp heating. The reaction does not all happen at once unless you add all the water at once. If you control the water addition slowly, the heat output is sustained over a longer period at a lower peak temperature. A small insulated container, something like a metal ammo can lined with fire brick or a cast iron Dutch oven with a lid partially open, can hold the reacting mass and radiate heat steadily for several hours rather than spiking and cooling. In my own testing in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas, over 2 fall trips, I ran a 1/2 pound of quicklime, roughly the volume of a full coffee mug, in a vented cast iron pot with a slow drip from a punctured water bag above it. The surface temperature of the pot stayed between 120 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, measured with an infrared thermometer for approximately 4 hours before the reaction slowed significantly. And that is one set of data from 2 trips, and I am not presenting it as a controlled study. But it is consistent with the chemistry, and it lines up with documentation from survival and emergency preparedness communities who have tested similar setups. A guy on iOverlander documented a nearly identical configuration, tested over 3 nights of shoulder season camping in the Guadalupe Mountains in West Texas, tracking surface temperature every 30 minutes through the night with a probe thermometer. His setup produced usable radiant heat for 4 to 5 hours per charge at ambient temperatures between 35 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. His numbers are his data from one specific setup in one specific environment, and I am not claiming they translate universally. But it is the kind of field documentation that is more useful than theoretical chemistry alone. The cost math is why this gets attention. Quicklime from a masonry supplier runs somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50 per pound, depending on your region and whether you are buying a small bag or in bulk. A half pound of quicklime, which produced 4 hours of usable heat in my testing, costs somewhere between 25 and 75 cents. A replacement propane canister for a portable heater runs $5 to $8 and lasts roughly the same duration on low setting. A Mr. Heater Buddy refill at current pricing runs about $8 per canister. 2 canisters per overnight trip on cold nights means $16 in fuel per night. At 10 cold night camping trips per year, that is $160 annually just in propane. The quicklime alternative at the same frequency of use costs roughly $7 to $15 for the season depending on your sourcing. The math is not close. That said, the propane heater requires almost no setup, has a known and predictable heat output, and can be adjusted or shut off instantly. The quicklime setup requires building and testing a container system, managing the drip rate, and accepting that the reaction does not have an off switch once it starts. Both of those things matter. I am not telling you to throw out your propane heater. I am telling you that at 10 nights per season over 15 years, you have spent somewhere in the range of $2,000 on propane for camp heat. And there is an alternative that produces the same result for around $50 over the same period. That accumulation is worth knowing about, even if you decide the simplicity of propane is worth the cost difference to you. Now, the safety section. This is where the title claim about 14 states comes in, and where you need to pay attention regardless of where you live. Calcium oxide is not a controlled substance. You can buy it at any masonry supplier in the country. What varies by state and by land management jurisdiction is how and where you can use it. The specific regulations that affect this application involve 2 things: open fire restrictions and chemical use restrictions in national forests and state parks. If 14 states have regulations under their Department of Natural Resources or State Forestry Authority that classify any non-flame heat source that uses chemical reactions as falling under the same permit requirements as open fire. That includes California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina under various specific statutes. The exact language varies. In California, the CAL FIRE regulation covers any heat-producing device in high fire risk zones during declared fire conditions. In Colorado, it falls under state forestry burn permit requirements in certain county classifications. I am not a lawyer, and I cannot tell you what the specific regulation in your specific county on your specific trip date says. Check with the Ranger District or Land Management Office before you use this. That is the only correct answer, and anyone telling you otherwise is guessing. If you are getting something out of this, hit subscribe. More of these coming. Beyond the regulatory picture, there are genuine physical safety considerations that apply everywhere, regardless of legal status. Calcium oxide in dry powder form is caustic. It is classified as a corrosive irritant. Direct skin contact with dry quicklime draws moisture from your skin and causes a chemical burn that looks and feels different from a thermal burn. It comes on slower and is easy to underestimate in the first few minutes. If dry quicklime contacts your skin, brush it off first before adding water. Adding water directly to quicklime on skin accelerates the reaction and makes the burn worse. Don't wash with large amounts of water after brushing. Eye contact is a medical emergency. Store and handle it in conditions where wind is minimal, or use a face shield. These are not extreme precautions for a fringe chemical. These are the standard handling instructions on every commercial quicklime safety data sheet. The steam produced in the early phase of the reaction, when you first add water, carries calcium hydroxide particles. Breathing that steam directly is harmful. Do not lean over the container when you add the initial water. Add water from a distance using a slow drip setup or a long-handled tool. Back away. and let the initial steam phase dissipate before you approach. The steam phase lasts approximately 60 to 90 seconds at the start of the reaction. After that, as the ongoing reaction is much lower in intensity, and the steam production drops significantly. The container matters more than most people realize, and getting this wrong turns a workable heating system into a mess or a hazard. Do not use plastic. Do not use aluminum. The heat from the reaction, which peaks near the top of the container where steam concentrates, will soften plastic, and the caustic calcium hydroxide slurry will begin corroding aluminum within a few uses. A cast iron Dutch oven, ideally a 3-quart or 4-quart size, roughly the diameter of a large dinner plate, handles both the temperature and the chemistry without issue and doubles as cooking gear. A military surplus steel ammo can with a steel insert tray inside also works well. Whatever container you choose, it needs to be vented. The reaction consumes no oxygen and produces no combustion gases, so ventilation is not about preventing asphyxiation. It is about allowing steam to escape so it does not build pressure in a sealed space. If you lid the container completely, steam pressure accumulates and the lid can blow off with enough force to spray caustic slurry. Crack the lid about a 1/4 inch, roughly the thickness of a pencil, or drill a series of 1/2 inch holes near the top edge of the container. The holes should be on the upper half, roughly above the midpoint of the container height when full, so slurry does not contact the openings directly during the reaction. Do not use this inside an enclosed tent or enclosed vehicle. The steam and residual caustic particulate do not belong in a breathing space. The correct application is a radiant heat source outside the tent near the door, or inside a vestibule, which is the covered entry area outside the main tent interior, with the tent door partially open to allow airflow. The heat radiates from the container like a small wood stove with no smoke and no flame. Position it so you are getting radiant heat from a distance of about 2 feet, roughly the width of a standard doorway, rather than direct contact with the container. If you are using a rooftop tent, the vestibule on most rooftop setups is not large enough to safely house the container with adequate clearance. In that configuration, place the container on the deck or roof platform at a safe distance from the entry ladder with a heat-resistant barrier between the container and any tent fabric. Now, rooftop tent canvas and most tent fabrics are not rated for sustained contact with a heat source in this temperature range. Keep at least 12 inches of clearance, roughly the length of a standard ruler, between the container and any fabric surface. Regional conditions affect the setup in ways worth knowing before your first trip. In the southeast, specifically the coastal plain regions of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, the high ambient humidity means the quicklime begins absorbing atmospheric moisture before you even add water, particularly if you store the bag open or in a non-sealed container. In humid conditions, buy quicklime in sealed bags and keep it sealed until you are ready to use it. Once you open the bag, any unused portion should go into a sealed container for storage. A wide-mouth mason jar with a lid works. Quicklime left open in high humidity will partially react with atmospheric moisture over hours and lose reactive capacity before you ever add the first drop of water at camp. In arid regions like the Coronado National Forest in Arizona, or the desert Southwest generally, this is not a concern, and the storage requirements are more forgiving. Transport requires specific attention. Calcium oxide and water in the same bag or the same storage box is a problem waiting to happen. Keep the quicklime in a sealed container in a separate location in the vehicle from any water source. A breached water container near an open bag of quicklime in a truck bed creates an uncontrolled reaction in a confined space that you will not appreciate. I keep my quicklime in a sealed wide-mouth stainless steel bottle, roughly the size of a large travel coffee mug, and stored in a separate bin from my water supply. The stainless steel handles the chemistry if there is any incidental moisture contact. Plastic can hold the powder fine in dry conditions, but I do not trust it as a primary container for this specific material over multiple trips. Stainless steel or sealed glass. Either works. Plastic for occasional storage in dry conditions only. Here is the container setup that controls the reaction rate and makes this practical. You need an outer cast iron or steel container, a steel inner container that sits inside it with about 1/2 inch of air gap on all sides, roughly the thickness of your little finger, and a water delivery system above. I use a wide-mouth stainless steel bottle with a nail hole in the cap, positioned above the container on a simple wire bracket. The nail hole drips water at a rate of about 1 drop per 2 seconds, which is slow enough to extend a half-pound charge over 4 to 5 hours, rather than exhausting it in 30 minutes. The outer container insulates the inner container, and the air gap provides additional thermal buffering. The result is a steady radiant heat output, rather than a violent initial spike. Set this up before dark, outside the tent on a non-combustible surface, rock or bare dirt, rather than grass or pine needle duff, and it functions as a radiant heat source through the night. The specific setup I described has limitations. It does not work well in sustained rain because the additional water contact with the exterior of the container accelerates the reaction unpredictably. Use a tarp above it, not over it, to keep rain off while allowing ventilation. At temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the slow drip water feed can freeze in the delivery system. In those conditions, insulate the water bottle and delivery mechanism. Above 90 degrees Fahrenheit ambient temperature, the application is pointless because you are not trying to generate heat. And on any trip where local regulations classify this as an open heat source requiring a permit, you need the permit or you need a different heating strategy. I am not interested in telling you to skip that step. The residue after the reaction completes is calcium hydroxide slurry, which is basically lime paste. It is not hazardous in the same way the dry calcium oxide was, but it is still basic, around pH 12, and should be disposed of appropriately. Do not dump it in a water source. Do not leave it in a pile that will stay wet and leach into the soil at a campsite. Let it dry fully in the container, which takes a day or so in open air, and then pack it out in a sealed bag or disperse it like gray water across a wide area, away from the water source and camp. The dried product is essentially garden lime at that point, and is not environmentally harmful in small quantities dispersed across soil. Let me put the commercial comparison in concrete terms before I close. Because it is the most persuasive version of the math, for people who are skeptical, this is worth the learning curve. A Mr. Heater, Little Buddy, propane heater runs about $50 for the unit. Propane canisters run $5 to $8 each. And the Little Buddy, on low burns through one canister in roughly 3 to 4 hours. That's 2 canisters per cold night means $10 to $16 per night in fuel alone. Over 10 cold camping nights per season, that is $100 to $160 in propane. Over 15 years of camping, which is how long I have been at this seriously. The propane cost for overnight heating alone approaches $1,500 to $2,400. The quicklime alternative requires one piece of container gear, a used cast iron Dutch oven that you can find at a thrift store for $8, roughly the weight of a half-gallon of milk and a masonry supplier account. The ongoing fuel cost is under $1 per night indefinitely. The total investment to run this system for 15 years, at the same frequency as the cost of the container, plus roughly $150 in quicklime. The propane heater is more convenient, more adjustable, and requires less preparation. Those are real trade-offs, but the financial comparison is not close. And for campers who are already comfortable building their own systems and doing the setup work, the case for learning, this is strong. The one thing I want to add that most discussions of this method skip entirely is a word about sourcing. Not all products sold as lime are calcium oxide. Hydrated lime, also called slaked lime or calcium hydroxide, is already the end product of this reaction. It generates no heat when you add water to it. If you buy the wrong product, you have a bag of inert white powder and zero heat. Look specifically for calcium oxide on the label. The chemical formula is CaO. Products marketed as quicklime or burnt lime are correct. Products marketed as hydrated lime, garden lime, or agricultural lime may or may not be the correct product depending on the specific formulation. Read the label. The masonry supplier will know the difference if you ask. $1 per night of sustained heat with no flame, no propane canister, and no ongoing fuel cost. The chemistry is 100 years old. The application to camp heating is underused because nobody is selling it in a branded package with a gear company logo on it. The setup takes about 20 minutes the first time you build the container system, and about 5 minutes per use after that. I'll run the whole thing at home before your first trip, so you understand the reaction rate and your specific drip speed before you are doing it in the dark at a campsite for the first time when the temperature is dropping and you are already tired from setup. Your specific drip rate calibration will differ from mine because water viscosity and the flow rate through a small opening are both affected by altitude and ambient temperature. At 5,000 feet, roughly the elevation of much of the Texas Hill Country, water moves slightly differently through a small hole than at sea level. Not dramatically, but enough that your 4-hour burn at home might be a 3.5-hour burn at altitude if you do not adjust the opening size. Find that calibration in the driveway before you need it at the campsite. This method has clear limits, and I want to be plain about them. It does not produce heat on demand the way a propane heater does. Once the reaction starts, it runs until the charge is exhausted or the water supply runs out. There is no thermostat and no off switch. If you load it and set it running at 9 p.m., you will have heat through roughly 1 a.m. depending on your charge size and drip rate. After that, you are relying on your sleeping bag and pad. Plan accordingly. For campers who need heat through the full night in genuinely cold conditions, this works as a first half of the night system paired with a properly rated sleep setup for the back half. For campers who need heat to take the edge off during the evening hours around camp before bed, it handles that job entirely. Know which one you are before you commit to the setup. The sourcing question matters more than people expect and gets skipped in most discussions of this method. Not all white powders sold in the lime category at masonry suppliers are calcium oxide. Hydrated lime, also called slaked lime or calcium hydroxide, is already the end product of this reaction and generates zero heat when you add water to it. Agricultural lime, which is calcium carbonate, also generates no heat. You need calcium oxide specifically. The chemical formula, CaO on the label, is the definitive confirmation. Products sold as quicklime or burnt lime are correct. When in doubt, ask the supplier directly. Any masonry supply worker who handles the product regularly will know which of their products is calcium oxide and which is not. This is not an obscure question in that context. They sell it to contractors who use it for specific applications, and they will know the difference. Buy the right product once and verify it. A bag of the wrong lime is a bag of white powder and nothing else.